Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, President and CEO of the Foundation, and your host for today's webinar. Today, Dr. Manpreet Singh will present Using Neuroscience to Evaluate and Guide Treatment for Pediatric Mood Disorders. The Brain and Behavior Research Foundation funds the most innovative ideas in neuroscience and psychiatry to better understand the causes and develop new ways to treat brain and behavior disorders. These disorders include addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, and schizophrenia. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded more than $408 million to more than 5,900 grants around the world. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Manpreet Singh. Dr. Singh is Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and Director of the Pediatric Mood Disorder Program at Stanford University School of Medicine. She was a 2016 Foundation Independent Investigator, a 2008 Young Investigator, and the 2012 Claremont Awards Honorable Mention. Today's webinar will begin with Dr. Singh's presentation. This will be followed by a question and answer period. To submit your questions, please use the Questions tab on the control panel. Feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many as possible in the time allotted. And now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Singh. Manpreet, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation, and for continuing to support my career in this area. I'm very pleased to be with you, and thank you all for your joining me today in this very surreal period in history. Here are my disclosures of potential conflicts. I will be highlighting research supported by these agencies and private foundations, particularly the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, during my presentation today, as well as collaborations with consultees. So what I'd love to do today to address the learning needs of a diverse audience is to make the information I present accessible and current, focusing my story to highlight how I think about understanding mood problems in youth. We've learned a lot in the past few decades, thanks in part to the development of gold standard structured interviews. I'd like to dedicate today's webinar to Dr. Barbara Geller, who developed the WashU CASADS, a specialized structured interview for mood disorders that enables researchers to systematically evaluate how children experience mood symptoms. I hope you find the portfolio of science that I present to you interesting. It's principally aimed to meet clinical unmet needs in pediatric mood disorders and to cultivate hope for patients and families. Here's what I'm going to cover today: how mood symptoms commonly present in youth, historical perspectives and the current state of the science, how neuroscience can guide us toward better evaluation, how neuroscience can guide us toward better treatment, limitations of current levels of evidence, and design considerations for future. To ease your navigation through this presentation, slide titles will call out illustrations of evaluation and treatment applications highlighted in red, and text with box summaries to findings and future directions to provide some exploration of future design considerations. Finally, I'll propose 5 strategic responses for a call to action to advance this very young field. So slides will be enumerated based on those 5 strategies, which I will define momentarily. So let's jump right in. The first thing I'd like to say is that pediatric mood disorders are associated with significant morbidity and mortality, but we don't talk about disability. And what I'd like to just share with you is an important statistic that we often don't focus on. It's that mood disorders are the first and the fourth leading causes of disability among young people worldwide. Depressive symptoms in particular can be very disabling. For example, anhedonia or loss of interest and psychomotor retardation may limit socializing with friends, participating in extracurricular activities, or attending school. And these issues become significant causes of functional impairment for youth today. What is the lifelong impact of mood disorders? Well, they start early. And for most adults with mood disorders, they report the onset occurs either in childhood or adolescence. They're chronic. Early onset mood disorders are associated with poorer long-term prognosis, suggesting that they recur for longer periods of time and don't get better with time, and are associated with increased risk for suicide compared with adult onset, bipolar and other mood disorders. Mood disorders are also frequent. Diagnosis in children and adolescents have been increasing, perhaps because we're doing a better job of recognizing these symptoms in children, but the prevalence rates are increasing, and this is evident in the epidemiology. Finally, mood disorders are complex, and they don't just stand alone. They often run with other conditions, which can complicate the process of diagnosis and treatment. So let's start with a case that hopefully illustrates to you some of the common symptom presentations for youth experiencing mood disorders. Here's Madison. She's a 16-year-old previously diagnosed with major depressive disorder and attention deficit with hyperactivity disorder, and unsuccessfully treated with a psychostimulant methylphenidate and an antidepressant escitalopram for 2 months. She says to her psychiatrist, "Everything's my fault. My dad's upset because my grades are down. I keep thinking they'd be better off without me." "I'm pretty sure they disagree, Madison. One thing at a time," says the child psychiatrist. "Why are your grades slipping?" "Oh, I don't know. It's just that lately I can't, concentrate. I don't know why. For the last couple of months, I haven't been sleeping. My mom complains I never eat enough, and I'm tired all the time. I used to love school, but now I don't enjoy much of anything. I feel like I'm always cranky." Child psychiatrist asks, "Do you think your family understands what you're going through?" "Not really. A year ago, they stuck me in a hospital, and now I think they want to do it again." "Tell me more about the hospital. How did you wind up there?" "Well, it was about a year ago. I was only sleeping a few hours a night. I couldn't get along with anybody. My parents said I was talking too fast, that I was always arguing, which I wasn't. They were starting the arguments. I couldn't help it. Thoughts were racing around in my head. It was like a month. My mom found something I wrote in my journal about dying, and they put me in the hospital." This story of Madison is something that we see clinically very commonly. And how do we approach kids like Madison? The current guidelines suggest that treatment should be centered on specific disorders and associated behaviors, like mood and anxiety or emotion dysregulation, irritability, temper tantrums, aggression, hyperactivity, impulsivity, sleep disturbances, or sexually acting out behaviors. The behaviors are what get the kids in trouble, either in a school setting, at home, or are so significant that they require acute hospitalization. Clinicians balance behavioral, cognitive, and psychosocial interventions with pharmacological interventions and try the least restrictive intervention first. They monitor, identify, and target and track, monitoring specific symptoms that over time should be responsive to the interventions. And this tracking is a very important part of understanding whether a treatment is successful or failing. Co-occurring conditions are, as I said before, the rule rather than the exception, so need to be addressed. But sometimes that puts us at risk for giving kids multiple medications or trying multiple things at the same time. which can create confusion. And so being systematic in terms of the treatment approach is very important. Assessing and monitoring for side effects is just as important as tracking symptoms, re-challenging kids with treatments that are alternatives to ones that didn't work. And if there's a limited response rate, it's often predictive of increased vulnerability to side effects. So this leads many clinicians to a chicken and the egg chase that we need to address clinically as a field. Another consideration for youth is that they are not little adults. They're not mini adults. Their physiologies are different. They have difficulties perhaps expressing their mood symptoms accurately. They might also experience confusing side effects that are conflated with symptoms. Cognitive dulling and restlessness can both be something that's associated with a medication side effect or be a symptom presentation of a mood disorder. And we base most of our information about how medications work on studies conducted in adults. But we know that the metabolism in the liver and kidneys are more efficient in children, and that neurotransmitter development is stable for some neurotransmitters, but dynamic in others. And there's really a lack of long-term safety data for most drugs. In fact, prolonged use may be harmful in very young children, and most long-term data are extrapolated from animal studies. Another important consideration for kids is that there may be some important sex differences. In adolescents, girls' body fat increases more than boys, and this may affect distribution of medication and half-life. So there are a number of pharmacodynamic and pharmacokinetic differences that may be very important and relevant on how to not only dose medications in kids, but how to pace the dosing. And this is a clear area that merits careful consideration in our current state of the science. The volume of distribution is linearly related to body weight, so less drug may be available for delivery than expected. So milligram per kilogram dosing is often done in pediatric domains, and this may be something that many child and adolescent psychiatrists might consider to not just correct for this, but to minimize side effects. In the end, we try our best to start low, go slow, and recognize too when higher doses may be tolerated and required through careful titration to find the right dose and balance between benefits against adverse effects. And then there's the issue of the placebo response. It's real, and it's especially real for youth with mood disorders, and in particular pediatric depression. So this is an important consideration for when we look at trials, clinical trials, we notice that major depression shows, clinical trials have shown only an incremental increase benefit in active drug compared to placebo, compared to other studies conducted in obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety disorders in youth. So this problem is something that is an opportunity for the field of pediatric mood disorders to leverage potentially the placebo effect, and that's something that we will talk about a little bit today. What are treatment goals for pediatric mood disorders? In the end, our goal is remission. And we don't just want to acutely fix a mood episode or correct a mood episode. We want to see kids getting back to their usual baselines and not feeling the long-term effects of chronic mood symptoms or recurrent mood symptoms. We want to be able to accurately formulate the target symptoms. They can be confusing, not just because of co-occurring conditions, but because sometimes simultaneous depressive symptoms and mania symptoms occur at the same time. In fact, mixed features are a very common phenomenon in kids. We also want to manage the side effects, co-occurring conditions, and treat the system, the family, the parents, the system in which kids live. A sobering story about my husband, who's a pediatric intensivist, who works in an intensive care unit, in a community intensive care unit, and has experienced a fairly significant increase in near fatal or fatal intoxications in the past several months since sheltering in. These issues are of significant concern to our field and require us to be rethinking how do we best provide frontline support for the mental health crisis that has ensued as a result of COVID-19. And we must figure out a way to manage the impact of negative, stressful life events, school issues, and family conflict, which are inevitable in this, as I said, surreal situation that we're in. And one of the things that I want to just shout out is that we have, as a collective, I was able to get my very close friends in my field to contribute to a clinical handbook for the diagnosis and treatment of pediatric mood disorders, which provides some guidances about best practices in the assessment and treatment of mood disorders. So I hope you'll check that out. Some historical perspectives that help provide some context for our approach. We know that there's a strong placebo effect. It's actually even stronger than it is in adults. Pediatric clinical trials in depression are dominated by symptomatic improvement with nonspecific clinical contact. So this nonspecific clinical contact may make it difficult to separate the effects of placebo from a drug, but it's also, as I said before, an opportunity for us to potentially leverage what we can do in many ways just by providing clinical contact with patients. And the additional benefit of specific psychotherapeutic or pharmacological treatment is on average modest. An antidepressant medication is effective in speeding up improvement, but more than a third of patients don't reach full remission even after prolonged treatment. The advantage of routinely combining medication with cognitive behavioral therapy is still unclear. Depressed, suicidal adolescents can benefit from CBT and medications, and CBT can certainly protect high-risk youth from developing a depressive episode. But this area is also ripe for further exploration. Depression is clinically heterogeneous, and as a result, we find ourselves trying to accurately determine what it is that we're treating. And effective interventions to prevent and treat depression in youth exist, but their therapeutic benefit can be small and dampened due to this clinical heterogeneity. More specifically, what we want to try to do is target interventions that are tailored to individual clinical and biological characteristics that hopefully can result in greater effectiveness and overall efficiency. Another area ripe for exploration is to better understand the longer-term effects both of mood symptoms and their treatments. We need to do more longitudinal observations to be able to guide principles of when to start and stop medications, and when medications potentially serve a preventative role. And finally, irritability can very commonly be mistaken as mania and not recognized as a symptom of depression. Depressive episodes are less common in young children, but depressive symptoms may intermingle with manic symptoms and go unreported. So these mixed states are very frequently observed and experienced by youth, but are relatively understudied, and the medication and psychotherapeutic options for these youth are limited. So we'll spend a little bit of time thinking about how to address those kinds of complex symptoms. Here's one study, which is a post hoc analysis of in youth 10 to 17 years of age with bipolar 1 depression, who were given lorazepam and placebo, or randomized to lorazepam and placebo. And this post hoc analysis looks at efficacy and safety profiles in youth, divided up based on whether or not they experience some of the hypomanic or subsyndromal symptoms that can sometimes go alongside depression. These kids had to be in depressive episodes during enrollment, and they were assessed for subthreshold mania symptoms. They could not have had a full manic episode or threshold mania symptoms during this trial. And so the target was these mini episodes or mini subthreshold symptoms of mania. And this post hoc analysis highlights that the kids that were who received lurasidone, whether they had some of these hypomanic symptoms or not, highlighted in green and blue, filled in shapes, they responded just as well and separated from placebo to lurasidone. So complex symptoms can be systematically evaluated in youth and be shown to respond to a pharmacological intervention compared to placebo, but we need to better understand the longer term effects of treatment on complex symptoms, especially if the complexity is what's driving a poor prognosis. And if we can demonstrate the durability of this response to prevent depressive symptoms and hypomania and mania episodes, then it's worth aspiring toward understanding this for any particular intervention. Why don't we always go for a magic bullet? I wish we could give one thing, is what my patients ask me when they come in presenting with symptoms. Doc, can you just fix this with one simple intervention? Well, this figure shows the number of small molecule and biologic US FDA approvals per inflation-adjusted $1 billion in research investment between 1950 and 2010. Yes, it's a bit dated, but what it's trying to convey is that many pharmaceutical companies have markedly cut their research efforts as a consequence of inverse Moore's law. It just basically represents the failure of complex physiological phenomenon to respond to simple interventions. Currently, translational research is caught in a feedback cycle whereby complex, multifactorial disease is confronted without sufficient understanding of human pathophysiology. It's been suggested that preclinical or animal models don't represent human disease because of differences among species, but this isn't the principal reasons they often fail to provide suitable models for human disease. A fundamental difference between an animal and a clinical testing is that in the animal world, the researcher can carefully select the model, whereas in the human world, the clinician has to confront the unpredictable nature of human genetics and diseases, as well as environmental factors that might contribute. In this space, we need 3 key breakthroughs to prevent mood disorders from lasting a lifetime. If not a magic bullet, what kind of research should we be doing? We need to invest energy in cultivating biomarkers or discovering biomarkers for early detection. We need preemptive interventions for those at risk in pre-symptomatic stages. And we need better treatments for people living with depression that predict and track outcomes. This is a call to action. And this is an important point to make because we're in a very unusual state of affairs right now globally. And as with many treatments, some progress can be made by trying to understand which approaches are most effective for which person, at what age, in what setting, and with what disorder and presenting problem. We clearly need more effective interventions to help youth who experience mood disorders across the continuum of severity, whether it's mild adjustment to psychological stressor to very severe treatment refractory mixed bipolar episodes. Siddhartha Mukherjee wrote an article in The New Yorker a few days ago and writes that medicine is a system for delivering care and support. It's also a system of information, quality control, and lab science. She says all of this needs fixing and aptly concludes that recovery is a word for the moment. It connotes a return to a previous state of well-being. For many patients with chronic conditions, though, treatment aims not to restore a baseline of precarious health, but to reach a higher baseline. Some of medicine's frailties are new, some are of long standing. But what the pandemic has exposed, call the experience a stress test, a biopsy, or a full body CT scan, it's painfully clear. Medicine needs to do more than recover. It needs to get better. And in the pursuit of getting better, we can cultivate hope for those who experience pathological hopelessness. Our program responds to this call to action with 5 specific strategies. The first strategy is to measure individual and family factors of risk and resilience. A second is to leverage neuroscience to understand how mood disorders emerge. Then we also test the safety and effectiveness of developmentally informed interventions, harness cutting-edge computational innovations to predict outcomes, and translate science to meet clinical unmet needs. What can we do? And why is resilience potentially an intriguing solution to preventing lifelong depression? Resilience is defined as a complex and dynamic process. It's the ability to adapt successfully to adversity, stressful life events, significant threat or trauma, and it's often considered on a continuum and can be cultivated with the potential for change across the lifespan. It's not a fixed attribute. It can push levels to increase resilience. Individuals can lower risk and their susceptibility, and it's a fluid state. Colleagues at Mount Sinai provide a 10-step prescription for how to cultivate resilience, including actions like reframing stressful thoughts, establishing and nurturing a supportive social network, or finding a resilient role model, playing to your strengths, and training your brain. None of these prescriptions are rocket science, but the science underlying these concepts is largely unknown and unexplored. That's where the brain intersects with the mind. So who will be resilient? Who will develop a mood disorder? Here are my kids. Everyone has a good day and everyone has a bad day. And what I've done here is illustrate to you that it is a family phenomenon, and mood disorders family history is a clear risk factor. So we use family history of depression and other mood disorders as our model system. And when we looked at kids of adults with bipolar disorder, what we found was that the more chaotic family environments in those youth, the more disconnected their brain networks were. We also discovered that we could use brain imaging to potentially delineate whether a marker of a neural phenotype was a risk marker or a representative of the full disorder, and that there were regional differences that could easily be distinguished in the brains of youth even preceding symptom onset. We also have discovered that stronger brain connectivity can predict resilient outcomes after 3 years and tracks with a key element to promoting resilience, which is prosocial behaviors, where we see that increased connectivity in areas that are important for self-awareness and cultivating those regions can actually lead to more prosocial behaviors, caring, nurturance, and connectedness to other children. Can we cultivate these prosocial behaviors to change the brain and change the outcome? There are some clues that suggest that we may be able to do this. How do we cultivate prosocial behaviors? Well, traditionally, when we have a non-specific clinical contact with our patients, most first-line healthcare providers will educate individuals presenting with symptoms about those symptoms. They'll do what we call psychoeducation. That traditional education, if combined with prosocial behavior training, such as facilitating more effective communication skills, including active listening and problem-solving skills to help patients develop a regulation around their mood symptoms by engaging higher order executive functions in their brains. That combination of traditional psychoeducation with prosocial behavior training, we call family-focused therapy when conducted in a family setting. And what we found when we did this recently reported on a study where we randomized kids to either family-focused therapy or enhanced care, that in fact, family-focused therapy for youth at high risk for bipolar disorder is associated with longer intervals between depressive episodes compared to just the traditional enhanced care psychoeducation. This particular study was recently published in JAMA Psychiatry, and an important future direction for this work is to clarify the relation between changes in family function and changes in the course of high-risk syndromes like bipolar disorder. In a subset of youth who received these treatments, we compared them to typically developing controls and conducted an independent components analysis, where we looked at networks in the brain and found that there were very unique phenotypes in the brain in terms of network connectivity at rest in youth at risk for bipolar disorder compared to healthy controls in the areas important for emotion regulation and self-awareness again. And what we found was that increased connectivity tracked with improved depression outcomes. So here we see in the youth that received family-focused therapy compared to enhanced care, a treatment by time interaction. When you compared the youth who had the treatments to healthy controls at baseline, their post-treatment connectivities were over connected for the youth who received family-focused therapy, and that increased connectivity corresponded to improved symptoms of depression. What that study essentially shows is that family-focused therapy is associated with improved functional connectivity between networks in the brain important for emotion processing and regulation. What we need to do next is clarify treatment-related changes in these neural pathways that may lead to early identification of bipolar disorder, possibly develop more personalized interventions, focusing on aspects of this particular intervention. What is it about the family therapy? Is it the problem solving? Is it the communication skills that is most effective in leading to brain plasticity or potentially more adaptive long-term outcomes? In any case, these studies help us understand potential putative mechanisms of action of psychotherapy in pediatric mood disorders, which are our mainstay first-line interventions for youth experiencing mood symptoms. We believe fundamentally, and there's a whole rich literature that supports that psychotherapy improves emotion regulation. It targets expressed emotion, treats the system. It improves the quality of family relationships and physical well-being. It improves prosocial behavior, and it may even have an interactive effect in augmenting a medication effect when combined to promote treatment adherence. And the most curious area that merits future study is to better understand if these kinds of interventions can actually cause or be associated with neuroplasticity. And so designing studies that can help us better understand this phenomenon and narrow the efficacy and effectiveness gap will be of great interest to the field. The next strategic approach, and by way of reminder, we know that comorbidity is a rule rather than the exception. Early life stress contributes early and significantly to neurodevelopment. Antidepressant treatment response in youth modestly separates from placebo, and combination therapies, psychotherapy plus medication, may yield the best short-term results, but when and how long to treat these youth is unknown. With this stuff in mind, with all of these principles in mind, it's important for us to design next studies that leverage neuroscience to better understand mechanisms underlying symptoms and how to treat them. So I'm going to show you a brain picture that helps us conceptualize the mechanistic ways in which we imagine the brain to be changing as a result of behavior modifications, and what physiologically may also come along for the ride. And this study that we proposed evaluating youth with depression and obesity to assess how how biological symptoms track over time. And using mechanistic designs with neural mediators temporally preceding our outcome of interest, we aim to examine children 9 to 17 years of age who are treatment seeking but treatment naive with depression and obesity. And you might say, well, why would you choose kids who have confounding or co-occurring conditions? Well, in our lives now, we see more and more kids who have all of these symptoms all happening at the same time. We should try not to design studies that exclude or seek to look at single conditions, given the fact that comorbidity is a rule rather than the exception. So we design studies mechanistically to look and evaluate and now better characterize these youth and investigate neural and behavioral trajectories over a 2-year course. We use constructs like the research domain criteria, approach motivation, and reward processing to better understand systems that might be confluent and provide more integrated understanding of how the brain is changing and developing in the context of reward seeking behaviors. In kids with depression, they often have a loss of interest, but may seek starchy and sugary foods or snacks to ameliorate their low moods. In the short term, it may have some improvement in mood, but in the long term can lead to increased risk for insulin resistance and even worsening self-esteem. But we sought to evaluate these youth, assess them at baseline 6 months and 24 months, and scan them with multimodal magnetic resonance imaging to obtain information about how their brains are structured, how they respond to monetary and food rewards, and look at early mediators of neurobiology for clinical worsening of depressive symptoms in 2 years. So far, we've learned a lot from these youth. We've learned that higher compared to lower levels of insulin resistance is associated with very specific brain and behavior outcomes. Higher youth with greater insulin resistance have higher levels of anhedonia, more food-seeking behaviors, as we expected and predicted. But they also have reduced hippocampal and anterior cingulate cortex volumes and greater levels of disconnectivity in the limbic and frontal reward network at rest. And for youth with higher levels of insulin resistance, thinner anterior cingulate cortices and smaller hippocampal volumes were also associated with more severe depressive symptoms, whereas the opposite was true for lower levels of insulin resistance. So here's an illustration. In these next 2 slides, you'll see again that you see a disconnected reward system in these youth, and you also see that there are important moderators for the biology, and specifically low versus high levels of abuse seems to moderate the reward connectivity. Let's break this down and unpack what this finding shows, which is that youth in high exposure to abuse, and this can range from emotional abuse, bullying, peer victimization, as well as other more serious forms of abuse. Those youth seem to have a very specific relations between insulin and glucose response and connectivities between reward regions and the prefrontal cortex, whereas in the low abuse youth, you see negative correlations or potentially protective mechanisms. And examining the longitudinal trajectories of these symptoms is our next plan to better understand not just the role of depressive symptoms and food-seeking behaviors, but also the impact of the unfortunate consequences of abuse exposure in these youth. These have treatment implications in that neural correlates can be potentially inferred for treatment development. This is a slide that highlights work by my collaborator, Dr. Natalie Raskin, and her team, very interested in the glucagon-like peptide 1 GLP agonist liraglutide, which is an insulin sensitizing agent that she presented to individuals who are at risk for Alzheimer's disease to see if targeting this insulin sensitivity could potentially improve cognitive and mood outcomes, in addition to improving the insulin sensitivity. And what this study showed that liraglutide does improve intrinsic connectivity within hippocampal and default mode networks, and baseline fasting glucose seemed to be associated with greater connectivity, though we did not see any cognitive differences between treatment groups in this particular study. So future directions for this work will include integrating knowledge from adult studies and designing trials like this that target reward function as well as cognitive function around memory and other areas that are rich with stress receptors and insulin receptors in the brain, so that we can utilize a multi-domain approach to address related comorbid conditions in a more unified fashion. My colleagues at UCSF, Dr. Tiffany Ho, is doing some very important work in understanding the brain characterization of suicide and suicidal behaviors in depressed adolescents, and has demonstrated distinct functional networks that subserve suicidal ideation and non-suicidal self-injury, which help us potentially develop treatments that could target these particular signatures. She also has shown neurochemical differences in depressed adolescents with suicidal ideation, showing that compared to other groups, there's clear evidence of increased glutamate in the anterior cingulate cortex, which can help us potentially think about excitatory neurotransmission and how it plays a role in the development of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. This is a clearly an important area of research that merits follow-up, and my colleagues in Spain have adapted dialectical behavioral therapy for adolescents in Spain, and have demonstrated that those youth that are high risk for suicide, when compared to presented with treatment as usual or group support intervention, this dialectical behavioral therapy manualized treatment reduces non-suicidal self-injury, reduces the use and need for antipsychotics, and improves overall functioning as measured by the Clinical Global Assessment Scale. Though both treatment arms showed improvement in secondary outcome measures, no suicide attempts, reassuringly, were reported in either group. And the study was demonstrated to show effective and feasible approaches to treating adolescents with high risks for suicide. Research in larger samples and combined with neuroscience tools could aid us in developing novel interventions to promote adaptive emotion regulation. And this study, Dr. Santamarina Perez, also scanned a subset of youth who received these treatments, and when they were compared to healthy controls, you saw not only that healthier connectivities or aberrant connectivity patterns in compared to healthy controls, you saw stronger negative connectivity predicting post-treatment improvement in non-suicidal self-injury. So given the potential for neuroplasticity during adolescence, we need larger sample sizes of youth randomized to these kinds of treatments to help us examine treatment-specific effects. What is it that group therapy or non-specific clinical contact versus a directed dialectical behavior therapy doing to the brain and the developing brain over time? Testing the safety and effectiveness of developmentally informed interventions is a key next step and strategy that we engage with. And we do this because we know there are very few FDA-approved agents. Here's a landscape for unipolar depression in kids. And the landscape is a little bit more developed in pediatric bipolar disorder. It's not without efforts. There's a ton of evidence for antidepressant use in youth. The FDA approvals are different depending on the mood disorders, but we still have some unmet needs in the pediatric bipolar space. And what we have started to do is take neuroimaging and do pharmaco-fMRI studies, which enable us to evaluate pre-post neural effects of youth who are randomized to these various pharmacological treatments. This area is relatively nascent, but is important to do in larger sample sizes so that we can actually improve our capacity for prediction and implement best practices for evidence for prediction. In this study, Dr. Kiki Chang and colleagues showed that youth who were randomized to quetiapine versus placebo showed differential responses in the brain, in the dorsal and the ventral prefrontal cortices in response to viewing negative and neutral pictures. And unpacking this further with larger sample sizes would be a very important future direction. How should we treat depressed youth who are at high risk for bipolar disorder? Well, definitely therapy first if possible, but then what? Do we give them an SSRI, bupropion, lamotrigine, lithium, quetiapine? None of these individual agents in and of themselves can help us understand fully what to do in these situations. They may all work, none of them may work, and we need to do a better job understanding how to help youth. And the reason why this is important is because some antidepressants can be associated with treatment emergent mania or hypomania. And we've noticed two particular risk factors that are at play: family history of bipolar disorder and age. In youth with a family history of bipolar disorder, antidepressant related adverse events can lead to discontinuation, more so in younger kids than in older kids. And if you look at the brains of these individuals, you see that there are youth who have been exposed to antidepressants and required discontinuation, showed reductions in volume, amygdala hyperactivity, deformations in the amygdala, network overconnectivity in emotion regulatory areas, as well as abnormal physiological vital signs like heart rates and blood pressure. We know that family history is the clearest risk factor for developing an antidepressant-related side effect. So we need to do a systematic assessment of whether antidepressants are helpful, particularly in kids who've never experienced a manic or hypomanic episode, and to examine risk factors and biological mechanisms that underlie adverse reactions to antidepressants so that we can not just understand the effects of antidepressants, but also potentially understand the placebo effect. We hope that this clinical trial that's currently underway in collaboration with University of Cincinnati will help us delineate, and supported both by the National Institute of Mental Health and the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, will hopefully help us better understand the mechanisms underlying whether antidepressants are helpful or potentially harmful to youth. And it's also important to describe that the potential behavioral and underscore the potential behavioral benefits of treatments, of behavioral treatments, because they can even reduce the need for medication. In this study recently published just earlier this month by my colleagues at Stony Brook, led by Dr. Gabriel Carlson, who's the current president of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, she found that children admitted to an inpatient psychiatry unit who had high rates of externalizing disorders like disruptive behavioral disorders, had higher rates of needing as needed medications or PRNs and seclusion restraints and holds compared to others. And rates of PRN and seclusions were significantly lower when there was a behavior modification program in place. So this helps us understand and stretch our knowledge to build a range of treatments that allow us to judge the effectiveness, not just on pharmacological treatments, but also the impact of behavioral treatments on mitigating the need for excessive use of medications to manage behaviors that are difficult to treat. We need to also harness cutting-edge computational innovations to interpret variability and predict outcomes. So this strategy can best be illustrated using large data sets that are now freely available and through the NIH database for genotypes and phenotypes. We were able to acquire the Philadelphia neurodevelopmental cohort and describe sex differences in the brain so that our understanding of the developing brain isn't just monocularly oriented toward a female brain or a male brain, and how that relates to the development of psychopathology in these youth. We can continue to engage with fancy latent variable and class analyses that might be more predictive than any single variable, but we have to be careful when we apply these fancy analytic tools, so that we can improve interpretability of data-derived features and ensure that we have a clear translation of these research findings to clinically relevant outcomes. The final strategy that we use is novel therapeutic discoveries to translate science to meet clinical unmet needs. And in this particular exciting work, it becomes very contextually relevant in the space where all of us have, or virtually all of us have shifted to telemedicine approaches in psychiatry. And this is a promising area of research to cultivate, because it's remarkable that we don't have an FDA-approved digital therapeutic for adolescent depression. So my colleagues at Limbix have developed a digital CBT app for adolescents with depression. And in their pilot study of 30 adolescents over 5 weeks, they found it was a feasible, well-liked app that reduced depressive symptoms, negative affect and anxiety, and improved positive affect. It was effective both as a standalone or as an adjunct to treatment as usual, such as medication or psychotherapy. And they are now embarking on a real-world study, and as well as developing sham-controlled randomized controlled trials in larger cohorts. These strategic partnerships are, in my view, critical to meeting clinical unmet needs in our field. Same true for more aggressive, intensive treatments for those youth that are very refractory to multiple other strategies. So for the more severe end of the spectrum, intermittent theta burst is becoming increasingly recognized as a safe and well-tolerated treatment, and may improve depressive symptoms in adults with depression. And we're working with Dr. Nolan Williams here at Stanford to develop and apply this exciting treatment for youth. And colleagues recently published a study that showed a feasibility and good tolerability in adolescent depression in 16 to 24-year-olds. We certainly need more sham-controlled, randomized controlled trials to better understand how this potential treatment could work, and in which context it might be most useful. So in the end, we have lots of drug development challenges and strategies that we need to think about for youth. Progress in novel therapeutics has been slow, and drug trials include participants from a wide age range with heterogeneous symptoms. Subjective outcome measures and the placebo effect have also contributed to failures in drug trials, particularly in unipolar depression. But what we ought to consider in our next stage of research and scientific portfolio development is consider the relevance of safety and more systematically assessing safety of available treatments, investigate complementary treatments, investigate and leverage the placebo response, repurpose existing treatments for other uses, and conduct collaborative research participation through developing trial networks, as has been done by our colleagues in cancer. And conduct trials that study or integrate mechanisms of change during psychotherapy. If we can learn from the past, perhaps we can leverage the placebo effect, develop pragmatic and effectiveness trials that help us do better treatment matching. And if we don't have anything good for anything bad, can we develop strategic partnerships and stimulate the next generation of clinician scientists to make advancements? We don't know if we can prevent mood disorders from lasting a lifetime, but can we design mechanistic and longitudinal studies to determine whether early neurobehavioral mediators can predict progressive and distal mood symptom change and treatment response. And this, in my view, is how we create a roadmap for the future. Children are not many adults. Youth with or at risk for mood disorders may show early signs of neurobiological dysfunction even before symptom onset. Effective, safe, preventative, pharmacological, and psychotherapeutic interventions do exist, and we need more combination comparative effectiveness studies and maintenance trials to examine the longer-term outcomes. I'd like to acknowledge our village finally and my list of many collaborators. It really does take a village to do this work. And I want to thank you again for your time and attention today. So, Dr. Wilk, what should we do now? Well, let's ask our expert audience. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Manpreet. What an outstanding presentation. The work that you have been doing, continue to do, is so important. And to hear from somebody who literally edited the textbook, literally, not just figuratively, is extraordinary. What should a parent do? They're not sure. They similar to the example with Madison, there's something off, but they're really not sure. What steps should a parent take if they're concerned about their child or adolescent?
It's a great question. There are a lot of things that parents can do, and the first step is to talk to their children and try to develop a dialogue. If that dialogue is hard, my children and I currently are doing Brain Pop, which is a nice app that engages in learning. The theme is the more you know, the more you know, and they did a terrific Brain Pop on depression, and it highlighted that there are a lot of things that parents can do, but children can also be motivated to start the conversation with a trusted adult. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Great. So it's important for us to begin the conversation, and if it's hard to have that conversation, to facilitate it through other means, through trusted confidants for the child, get them comfortable. And then if that's hard to do, then to seek help. And the first a step could be a pediatrician or a primary care provider, and systematically, if more help is needed, to reach out to a mental health professional. These steps are easily accessible to a lot of kids and families. I know that we are very burdened in terms of our healthcare system, but educators, first-line care physicians, the mental health professionals that are out there can be collaborative and work as a team to potentially address these very important unmet needs. My hope is too that we can begin to offer more digital options for patients and families so that they have at their fingertips accessible resources, both in terms of information that is curated and evidence-based and provided by guidance that is tested and evaluated by clinicians. And so it's a reliable source of information, and that families can not just have access to this information, but be able to implement some tools even in their home settings very, very soon. So I hope that those strategies are helpful.
Hi.
Go ahead.
I hear you now. I didn't hear you for a while, so.
Okay. Go ahead, Dr. Borenstein.
Okay, good. Did you hear the question? I guess that.
I did. Thank
yes,
you.
I did.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you.
My hope is that the audience was able to hear my my response there.
They did. They did.
Okay. Great. Good. Excellent. Well, I want to again say thank you so much for all that you do, for joining us today. I want to also thank everybody for joining us today for the webinar. 100% of all donor contributions for research are invested in our grants to scientists. All of the research we fund is made possible through supporters like you, so please consider making a gift by visiting bbrfoundation.org or call us at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion or would like to share it with family or friends, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. I hope you'll join us again in June when Dr. Eli Leibowitz, Associate Professor and Director of the Program for Anxiety Disorders at the Child Study Center at the Yale School of Medicine, will present the science of parenting and parent-based treatment for childhood anxiety disorders. This webinar will take place on Tuesday, June 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Once again, thank you for joining us, and I hope that you and your families are well and stay safe. Take care.